everyone. I'm Jeannie Linke Northrup. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for today's broadcast entitled Transform Real-World Evidence Insights with Innovative Data Solutions, sponsored by NTT DATA. NTT DATA is a trusted global innovator of business and technology services, helping clients innovate, optimize, and transform for success. As a global top employer, NTT DATA has a diverse group of experts in more than 50 countries, as well as a robust partner ecosystem. NTT DATA is part of the NTT Group. You can learn more about them at us.nttdata.com. Before we begin with today's broadcast, I have just a few important announcements to make. First and foremost, this webcast today is designed to be interactive. We have three great presenters joining us who are eagerly waiting to not only share their messages with you, but respond to any questions you may have based on their presentation. You can submit any questions you have for them by typing them in the Q&A box. That box is found at the bottom of your video player. For viewing purposes, you can enlarge your slide window by clicking on the small icon located in the bottom right corner of the media player. Please note, however, that all slides will advance automatically throughout the event. If you do happen to experience any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the question mark help widget located in the top right of your presentation window. I would now like to welcome today's presenters. First, I'd like to introduce Mark Feeney. Mark is an accomplished healthcare analytics professional with 25 plus years of diverse experience within the life science industry, helping support leading service providers to the pharma industry. He joins us with expertise in applying real-world evidence solutions to provide key insights to pharma execs, health economics and outcomes research analysis, and real-world data. This includes patient-level claims, lab and electronic health records, Salesforce effectiveness, and geomarketing analysis. I'd also like to introduce Madhur Garg. Madhur joins us today with 15 plus years of healthcare experience. He's a market access strategist with hands-on real-world evidence and health economics and outcomes research skills. He has experience across pharma and CRO settings, leading cross-functional teams at regional and global levels. He also has experience with major payers and health technology assessment bodies across Europe, North America, as well as the Asia-Pacific region. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Pierre Etienne. Pierre is a pharma industry veteran with 30 plus years experience in the pharma industry and in leading small biotech firms. He spearheaded large initiatives and secured funding, and in psychiatry practice and research, he's also worked for 10 plus years. He is a chief medical officer and co-founder of ActuReal Incorporated. He's a co-director of the Alzheimer's Disease Prevention Program, and he's director of the Clinical Research Division of the Douglas Research Center at McGill University. Gentlemen, thank you so much. You all have a tremendous resume coupled together by partnering together for today's presentation. I'm really looking forward to all of your insights. All of these years of experience in the field are coming together, and we're looking forward to your presentation. So feel free to go ahead and begin with today's presentation.
Thank you for the introductions. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Feeney, and along with my NTT DATA colleagues, Pierre and Madhur, we welcome you to our webinar on transforming real-world evidence insights with innovative data solutions. Before we jump into the webinar, I would like to provide a quick overview of NTT DATA. NTT DATA is a global technology leader, and we are part of the NTT Group that has over $100 billion in annual revenue and over 300,000 employees. With our consultative approach, deep industry expertise, and leading-edge technologies, we help clients worldwide accelerate their digital journey. A key differentiator for our digital life sciences enterprise is insights-driven marketing and provider and patient engagement with utilizing conversational AI for pharma marketing and accelerating the capture of real-world evidence to improve therapeutic efficacy and patient health outcomes. For today's webinar, we will be focusing on real-world evidence for life sciences. Extracting meaningful insights from real-world data is essential for organizations focused on improving patient outcomes and reducing healthcare costs. In today's webinar, we will discuss how the Charleston Comorbidity Index can provide additional insights from real-world evidence studies. We'll overview a few examples that show how this approach can enhance understanding of complex patient conditions. And finally, we will dive deeper into a case study that describes the evolution of health profiles of congestive heart failure patients based on patient data from NTT DATA's Health Data Bank. At this point, I'd like to ask my colleague Pierre to share the history of this specific use case. Pierre?
Yes, about 2 years ago, I had a conversation with a pharma executive who was very disappointed by results the company had just obtained in a real-world evidence study that started shortly after launch. And he had a theory for his disappointment of the results. I mean, his theory was that early on, post-launch, the patients being prescribed a new drug are the sickest. And they are so different from the patients in phase 3 that you can't help but having disappointing results. So we were intrigued about this, and we were wondering whether it is indeed true that early on, post-launch, the patients being started on a new drug are the sickest, or is it the other way around? Or does it vary from one indication to another? All these questions were unanswered. And NTT DATA was very interested in exploring the thing, and that's how we started. And this is what we are going to hear.
Thanks, Pierre. The Charleston Comorbidity Index. The Charleston Comorbidity Index predicts the mortality rate or survival rate for patients who have a range of concurrent conditions or comorbidities, such as heart disease, AIDS, or cancer. The index was first developed by Mary Charleston and colleagues in 1987, but the methodology has been adapted several times since then, based on the findings of additional studies. Many variations of the Charleston Comorbidity Index have been presented. There are 17 comorbid conditions used in the index calculation. Each condition is given a score from 1 to 6. In addition, a patient's age, for those over 50, is given an additional score. The scores are then summed to provide a total score to predict mortality. A score of 0 means no comorbidities were found. The higher the score, the higher predicted mortality rate. The Charleston Comorbidity Index is one of the most widely used scoring systems for comorbidities. In this slide, we identify a table that shows the comorbidities that make up the index and the scores for each comorbidity. As you can see from the table, there are comorbidities such as myocardial infarction, congestive heart failure, vascular disease, and so forth. The column to the right identifies a score a patient would get, ranging from 1 to 6, based on each of these comorbidities. In addition, the age table identifies an additional score a patient would get based on their age. Patients under the age of 50 would not receive any additional score, while patients over the age of 50 would get a score between 1 and 4 based on their age. The index is calculated as the sum of the comorbidity score plus the age score. For example, if a patient had the top 3 comorbidities and was 65 years old, they would get a total score of 5. Patient-level medical claims data that contains diagnosis claim information is typically required to calculate the Charleston Index score. This slide displays a table showing the approximate reduction in survival probability for each additional unit added to the Charleston Comorbidity Index score. As an example, if a patient had a score of 3, their estimated 10-year survival rate would be 77%. If you look down towards the bottom of the table, if a patient had a score of 12, their estimated 10-year survival rate would only be at 2%. There are a few instances where the survival rate drops rather quickly, such as going from a score of 3 to 4 and also from a score of 5 to 6. I'm going to hand this slide off to Madhur, who will walk us through some real-world evidence use cases using the Charlson Comorbidity Index. Madhur?
Thanks, Mark. So Charlson Comorbidity Index, CCI for short, is an interesting derived variable. As Mark just explained, it has this predictive prognostic value, which helps us understand the severity of the patient cohort we are dealing with, and also predictively extrapolate the 10-year mortality risk. It has various uses, including as a covariate, so something that influences the outcome indirectly. Thus, it is used in many aspects of statistical analysis, especially when dealing with claims data, certain kind of chronic conditions, for propensity score matching. Example would be to predict severity, but also to adjust and stratify various cohorts based on that severity. Some of the use cases of CCI have been elaborated in this particular slide. So you could use CCI for geographic distribution, again, as a severity prognosis proxy. You could then do correlation of CCI by various age segments, the cost of healthcare, etc. Other things, other use cases, for example, using a phase 3 inclusion-exclusion criteria to generate a cohort of patients that match the phase 3 criteria, so the phase 3 protocol equivalents, and then use CCI to extrapolate a 10-year mortality score or risk for the population, which would be an interesting analysis. Again, using CCI for health resource utilization remains a very commonly used use case where you use CCI after correlation to either extrapolate or predict costs over time. So that is it's a very widely used outcome which can be either applied as a covariate for various statistical analysis. So with that, I would hand it back to Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Madhur. Very insightful. We'll now look at a specific real-world evidence use case that examines the evolution of the health phenotype of congestive heart failure patients who started on Entresto. As part of this case study, we will use the Charlson Comorbidity Index as a proxy for poor overall health. We will gain a better understanding of the profile, health, and cost outcomes of these patients, including age, gender, and race, utilization of healthcare services, including inpatient, outpatient, professional, and pharmacy, and the cost of these healthcare services over a 5-year time period. A few of the objectives we're trying to accomplish as part of this case study is, are there any differences in the Entresto starters' clinical status measured by the Charlson Comorbidity Index, healthcare resource utilizations, the number of claims by claim type, the healthcare costs by claim type, and all of this over a 5-year time period. Entresto starters refer to those patients who had been treated with Entresto for the first time in their healthcare journey. As part of this case study, we're using NTT DATA's Health Data Bank, consisting of medical and pharmacy claims data with over 100 million patient lives. The data includes sources from CMS, Medicaid, Medicare Advantage, and commercial plans. For the specific analysis, we defined a patient cohort of those patients who live in the state of Oregon who have been diagnosed with congestive heart failure during any of that time within that 5-year period. And we used all the patient's medical and pharmacy claims during that period. The process for the analysis was as follows. Again, we identified all patients that had a CHF diagnosis from the diagnosis fields on the medical claims data from the state of Oregon from 2018 to 2022. The claims records have multiple diagnosis code fields, and we looked at all of them for the CHF diagnosis. We created 3 data tables: the enrollments table, which contains CHF patients with demographic data and their enrollment start and end dates; a medical claims table, which contains all of the patients' medical and pharmacy claims data; and finally, the pharmacy claims table, which contains all of the patients' pharmacy claims for the 5-year period. We identified Entresto starters, which are those patients with a first Entresto claim at least 3 months post their plan enrollment start date. And we grouped the Entresto starters by year, 1 for each year, starting in 2018 through 2022. We calculated the patient Charlson index score for each patient based on the medical claim data within the first year of an Entresto claim. And then finally, we calculated the healthcare resource utilization and costs by claim type for the month of the Entresto claim plus 3 months post first Entresto claim. There are approximately 81,000 patients who had a CHF diagnosis in any of the 5-year period. Of that, there are approximately 3,100 patients who had an Entresto pharmacy claim. And of that, we identified about 2,500 patients as Entresto starters. Again, Entresto starters are all unique patients with a first Entresto claim at least 3 months after enrollment in the health plan. For the remainder of the case study, we'll focus on the Entresto starters. This slide identifies the age and gender of those starters. As we mentioned in the previous slide, there were approximately 2,500 starters. Of that, 34% of them female and 66% are male, and 83% were over the age of 50. This table displays the distribution of Entresto starters by age and gender. When we look specifically at the Entresto starters in the Charlson Comorbidity Index, we can see that the score ranges from 1 to 15, with a median score of the starters being 5.6. We've segmented the Charlson Index score into 3 different segments of mild, moderate, and severe, with mild scores between 1 and 3, moderate scores between 4 and 5, and severe scores of those patients with a score of 6 or higher. These segments are based on the estimated survival reduction table we had shown earlier in the presentation. The table shows the distribution of patients within the mild, moderate, and severe categories, where approximately 50% of the patients fall into the severe category. When we look at the patients in their Charlson Comorbidity Index, we can see an upward trend in the index score over the 5-year period. There's approximately a 1-point score increase from 2018 to 2022. Even though this increase may not seem that large, it's actually a pretty significant, as 1-point increase in CCI from 5 to 6 drops the estimated 10-year survival rate from 21% to 9%, based on estimated survival reduction table. Over the next few slides, we'll take a look at health resource utilization and the cost of patients over the 5-year period. As we can see from this slide, there is a year-over-year increase of healthcare costs. There is a similar trend for all costs versus costs without Entresto claims. The chart identifies the cost for patients per member per month, 4 months post the Entresto claim over the 5-year period. In the chart, the blue bar represents the cost of all medical and pharmacy costs, and the orange bar represents all medical costs and pharmacy costs excluding Entresto claims. By using the per member per month metric, or PMPM, the costs are averaged out per member over 4 months of claim activity. we can see that patients who started Entresto in 2018 versus patients who started later have lower healthcare costs. One note, early-late Entresto refers to the year which they had started Entresto, not with respect to when a patient was first diagnosed with CHF. On this slide, we overlay the Charlson Comorbidity Index on the healthcare cost chart we just seen in the previous slide. We can see a similar upward trend of CCI and costs. So both combined, the trend is still in the upward direction. We have performed some statistical tests as well to identify the significance of these results, which we'll show later in the case study. This slide displays the healthcare resource utilization measured by medical and pharmacy claims and associated claim costs. We've identified a table with all those metrics over the 5-year period. As we can see by that middle column highlighted in red, there's an upward trend for per member per month medical costs. And if we look at some of the other numbers in the table, for example, the total claims, we can see there's also an upward trend, but perhaps not as prominent as the costs. And the table identifies the claims and costs with and without Entresto, and they all have a similar increasing trend. In this slide, we're looking at Entresto starters segmented by claim type. We can see that in the trend table below, we've identified 5 different types of claims in the analysis. And those are inpatient claims, outpatient claims, professional claims, other claims, and pharmacy claims. When we look at the chart, we can see that inpatient and outpatient claim costs, represented by the blue and orange bars, account for most of the costs. And it's interesting that the inpatient costs increase year over year, whereas the remaining claim costs a little bit more stable year over year. I'm going to hand this slide over to Madhur, and he's going to talk a little bit about how we perform some statistical analysis on the data. Madhur?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. So very quickly, we performed essentially a trend analysis to understand how some of these variables, specifically the per member per month cost and the CCI score, trend over time, and whether the trend and the difference is statistically significant or not. Right. So, first talking about the per member per month cost, as Mark explained how we calculated it after the Entresto claim. So we did a Mann-Kendall trend test to look at the per member per month cost, both including medical and pharmacy claim with Entresto, and which was found to be statistically significant, a p-value of 0.01. Similarly, we did a Mann-Kendall trend test for the average CCI score, again over 5 years. P-value of that was again 0.04, so less than 0.05, which was again found to be statistically significant, though of course it's not as strong as that for the per member per month cost p-value in the metric. Then what is also interesting is we did a correlation between the per member per month cost and the average CCI score using the Spearman's rank correlation coefficient. And we found a very positive, a strong positive correlation with a Spearman's coefficient of 0.9. So which is interesting, and it just shows you how CCI can be used not only to make sure that you adjust for CCI change and severity amongst the cohorts over a period of time, and how it can have an effect in all sorts of comparative analysis one can do in terms of indirect treatment comparisons, etc. So with that, I'd hand it back to Mark. Mark, over to you. Thank you.
So as we wrap up this specific CHF case study that we used the Charlson Comorbidity Index for, this slide just identifies some of the summary findings that we found. So we saw that the Entresto starters, again, those are the patients who had started Entresto for the first time in their healthcare journey. Their mean score of the index was in the moderate category. Again, their mean was just over 5, and that fell into the moderate category. We saw that there was an incremental increase in the index score, and that certainly has healthcare and cost consequences. The increasing CCI trend over time for the Entresto starters, and we saw that there was year-over-year increase of healthcare costs for those Entresto starters. There was a similar trend for when we looked at all medical and pharmacy costs versus all medical pharmacy costs excluding Entresto claims. We also looked at the specific types of claims, and again, inpatient, outpatient, and so forth. And we saw that when we looked at the claims per member per month, there certainly was an increase as well, but not as prominent as the costs. Inpatient and outpatient account for most of the costs, with inpatient costs trending, increasing year over year. And finally, as Madhur just walked us through some of the statistically significant results that were performed on the analysis as well. I'd just like to hand it over to Pierre and Madhur if they had any final questions or thoughts on the case study before we move on to wrapping up the webinar.
Yes, Mark. I mean, if we go back to the theory of the pharma executive I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, it appears to be wrong. But this whole work shows is that the patients enrolled or are starting on Entresto early on are not as sick as those who are started later, years later after launch. So for whatever reason, physicians' prudence, external constraints like some formulary constraints and so forth, early on, they have relatively well patients, and later on, as the years go by, you have sicker and sicker patients, not from the point of view, not from a CHF point of view necessarily, but for other indications, other comorbidities. Now, we don't know whether this trend is true for all indications or all types of illnesses. It could be different in cancer. We don't know. It could be different for other drugs. But we have done a similar work, not as extensive, with Eliquis that we presented at ISPOR in May. And the trend is, for Eliquis, very similar to what you see here with Entresto. At least these are two cardiovascular drugs, and there may be a story about it. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Pierre, and thanks, Mark. I would like to just add, one quick remark. So it's interesting in terms of how, what sort of implications this would have for conducting, comparison between cohorts over a period of time, right? Knows that it's not exactly an orange to orange comparison or, apple to apple comparison over a period of time, and one needs to be mindful of how significant the difference is, whether a covariate like CCI, needs to be adjusted. Of course, CCI applies to, CHF and other chronic conditions, but, this is the case in point that do think of CCI as a covariate, across when thinking about a cohort over the years, particularly in the real world context, and how one can use that to make sure that your study design is robust and comparisons are more valid, especially over a period of time. So thank you.
Thanks, Pierre and Madhur, for those insightful comments. As we wrap up the webinar, I'd like to thank everybody for joining. We discussed the Charlson Comorbidity Index, what it is, the methodology for calculating the index, and its potential for real-world evidence studies within life sciences. We did a deeper dive into a CHF case study using medical and pharmacy claims data to gain a better understanding of the evolution of patients being treated with Entresto. And specifically, we looked at Entresto starters and those starters who started Entresto treatment early versus late. And we identified the healthcare resource utilization, cost comparisons, and the Charlson Comorbidity Index for these groups. Again, thank you for joining our webinar, and we hope you found it interesting.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much, Pierre Medor. Fantastic presentation. I've seen quite a few questions starting to generate in from our audience members, so I'd like to thank them as well for their participation, as well as their interest in today's program. Before we jump into our Q&A session, though, for anyone who may have joined a little late, I want to remind you it is not too late, and feel free to submit any questions you have to our guest presenters. You can submit your questions by typing them in the Q&A box. That box can be found right below your video player. Now, as we go to jump into our Q&A session too, erring on the side of caution that we may not have time to respond to all questions live today, do not be discouraged and do not hesitate to continue asking questions throughout the Q&A session. Our thought leaders will also be reviewing and responding to your questions offline as well. All right, as we jump into our Q&A session, gentlemen, first question today. What are the benefits of real-world evidence studies over clinical studies? What are the limitations here against clinical trials, and what do you guys think about overcoming those challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll jump in. And Madhur, you have a lot of experience with working with clinical trial data too, so please jump in after that. Certainly clinical trials is at a fixed time period or a small number of patients typically. And it's a closed analysis. Real-world evidence studies, encompass potentially, hundreds of thousands of more potentially patients, right? And over a long period of time. We can follow patients over 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, right? Depends on the data. So the key that is following patients over time longitudinally, identifying what conditions they might have, their healthcare journey, their patient journey. It gives us a lot of insights above and beyond just a closed clinical study trial. But Madhur, please jump in there.
Sure, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so real world evidence is, it's not like a either or situation. It should be complementary to the RCT. It's like, from a strategy point of view, you got to have a continuum between the RCT and the real world evidence. And I think that was the genesis of how, PA described it, that somehow when you end up in a situation where real world evidence does not, continue with your RCT strategy, that is where the problem can be. Of course, there are differences. Real world evidence is far more messier, right? It has, because it's from the real world, so you don't have a very strict inclusion exclusion criteria, and that's interesting because although it's a challenge to deal with it from a comparative effectiveness perspective, but it adds to the richness of the information, right? And how you handle some of those intricacies, I think, in the webinar today, this entire theme kind of focuses on that CCI was a proxy for severity, and the fact that, there was an underlying severity change in the same population that was tracked over a period of time. So, from a statistical methodology perspective, how do you adjust that? How do you account for that change in severity to make the comparison statistically robust and valid? So I think, I'm just continuing on, but the whole idea is that there should be continuation. It's not a matter of, RWE being better than RCT either or. RCT still is the gold standard, but your real world evidence strategy should be in continuation. You should, proactively think about real world evidence at the time of designing clinical trials and informing them accordingly. So I think, yeah, that's where I will leave it. But if Pierre wants to add anything, please feel free.
You said it all, Madhur. Thanks.
It was very well said, Pierre, and I liked your word complimentary. Very well said. Thank you, gentlemen. Our next question here, so in regard to the phase 3 patients, how were the patients, just reading, how these phase 3, equivalent to phase 3 patients were based on IE criteria? How were these patients selected?
Yeah, I mean, we came up with our own inclusion case studies. Certainly, you know, it can be changed based on individual case studies and what you're trying to achieve, right? So, you know, we came up with our case study of CHF patients and specifically wanted to look at Entresto starters because, as Pierre had mentioned earlier on, you know, we're really focused on, are there any clinical differences between patients who started their Entresto before or later in their healthcare journey? So obviously, depending on what you're trying to solve, what your hypothesis might be, what problem you're trying to solve, you know, your inclusion, exclusion criteria, it could be vastly different. But for this particular case study, that's what we focused on was CHF patients having Entresto. So we were able to identify when they first had their Entresto claim by looking at the longitudinal claims data. So we know that they had their first claim, you know, it was 3 months post being started on a healthcare plan. So we identified those Entresto patients and then kind of followed them over that 5-year period. But again, you know, depending on your study, the inclusion exclusion criteria could vary, you know, dramatically.
Thank you so much, Mark. Now, in terms of your the data from all this, is the data de-identified? And then I'm going to have a follow-up to that. What kind of data lag have you seen here?
Yeah, so our data is a health data bank that NTT has. It comes from a variety of different sources, both commercial plans and government plans, you know, CMS and so forth. And it is all de-identified data. So we have their enrollment tables, so we know demographic information about the patients. But again, we have all the medical and pharmacy claims. So it's all de-identifiable. And then we provide aggregated or insights, you know, based on that data. So we don't sell data. We're just providing, you know, insights as a service, if you will, based on that identifiable data. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I can pick up on the lag issue. I mean, so, you know, so generally there is some sort of latency, right? So, for example, with claims data, it's not exactly real time. So there's something called open claims and there's something called adjudicated and closed claim. And as you would expect, there is, you know, it takes time for the claim to be opened, processed, and closed, and then to become available in the system. And all of this, you know, accounts for the lag and latency. So thus, you know, this keeps on updating over a period of time. And I mean, there is an inherent data lag built in, but that's accounted for in the sense it's known, understood, and well kind of documented.
Thank you. So another question here then. Are any of you aware of any study that compares conclusions based on real-world evidence studies and findings in clinical studies? And then your thoughts on the accuracy of the conclusions that have come from the assessment?
So is that, Madhur, what do you think? You doing a study of a phase 3 trial, for example, and then using a real-world evidence study to confirm the results of that, perhaps? Is that perhaps what the members, the audience members thinking?
Right. I'm just trying to understand the question better. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it can work. I mean, let me just, you know, share my thoughts on this. So, you know, in a way, you want to make sure that you take into account real world evidence and real world data to design your RCT program, right? So what do I mean by that? So making sure that the outcomes that you account for and measure for, you have tested that, you know, they are in consonance with the real world data out there, right? Then the inclusion exclusion criteria. So I mean, there is CHF, but other measures like glomerular filtration rate, EGFR, and sort of kidney disease, etc. You want to tweak the inclusion-exclusion criteria to align your RCT protocol with the real-world evidence out there. So meaning you are already thinking of and having real-world data when you're doing phase 2, phase 3 studies. Not only that, but you can go one step ahead. You can predict the results of clinical trials, extrapolate in a comparative manner by looking and accounting for real world evidence, right? So there are various ways of doing that, and there are groups out there which have done, which have undertaken initiatives like RCT duplicate, where they are doing exactly this for certain kind of patient populations. I think what I recall off the top of my head, they did this for the SGLT2 inhibitors in diabetes, so T2DM, where some of these initiatives have been well received. So bottom line, again, it's not a matter of what comes first or after. You got to think this through holistically in terms of designing the RCT studies, and then once the product is, of course, launched, real world evidence kind of continuing and taking that over. Of course, traditionally, RCTs are designed to get the drug a regulatory approval and label. That's the primary reason why companies invest kind of billions of dollars in doing a RCT. And real world evidence is now being accepted more and more, not only by payers, which want to look at effectiveness of the data in the real world, but also, we know regulators like US FDA and EMA are interested in real world evidence. So I'll stop there, but I don't know if that kind of just throws some light on this issue.
Thank you. So, gentlemen, I want to move on. We all know of the Paradigm HF study, right? That's a very key trial in this part of the healthcare realm. So, there were some differences between the randomized controlled trial and the real-world data that were demonstrated. This next question: were you able to confirm the results of the Paradigm HF study?
The answer is no, because we didn't look for that. We didn't look for, the main endpoint for the Paradigm study is the survival for several years. I can't remember, 5 years or something like that. And, our study was too short as too short a period of investigation to confirm the Paradigm study.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's something that's absolutely right, Pierre. But that's something that we could certainly look into, in future studies, future analysis, is to kind of extend. And it's interesting by working with Pierre Amador and the team. The deeper we looked into this analysis, more questions came up, right? And there's so many different ways you can slice the data to find meaningful insights, and a lot more questions came up because of the analysis. So. We're looking forward to kind of extend it to do different things with our database that we have, and look at potentially using the Charleston Index in different therapeutic areas as well, to see if we get similar results. So it's a lot of things that we can do, and exciting things that we can do in real world evidence. So for sure. So we're looking forward to doing those additional studies going forward.
Thank you. And on that note, have you or are you considering adjusting the results by age?
Well, I'll let Pierre answer.
Certainly do that.
CCI has age, inbuilt. But sorry, I was speaking over Pierre, so I'll let him elaborate.
Easily done, but you may reduce the number of patients. You may no longer have the statistical power that you had with looking at the whole group. But we could also combine what was found in Oregon with other states, and have a sample large enough to explore those questions.
Yeah, we certainly have the age data, right? We did break out by age and gender. We can specifically look at CCI by age. Certainly, the older you get, right? It's just nature. Your health goes down. You'll have more comorbidities, which raises the Charlson Comorbidity Index. And then, as we saw, there's a strong correlation between the Charlson Comorbidity Index and healthcare costs, measured over time and by age. So there's a very strong correlation there that, Medora talked through with our statistical significance test as well. So yeah, looking forward to do some of these other analysis as well.
Yeah, and just thinking this through, I would, think of, rather than adjusting, one can perhaps stratify it by age, have certain age groups according to, classic bell-shaped curve. Looking at various years, 2018 to 2022. But again, as Pierre said, you could go ahead and make the age groups similar, and then you would have attrition of some, patients who fall outside a particular threshold. So, there are various ways of doing it. Yeah, I guess.
There is something that maybe we didn't stress enough. It has to do with trying to understand this correlation between the CCI and healthcare costs. The correlation is very strong, but one should remind ourselves that for CHF, the patients had a score of 1. So the correlation is driven by comorbidities other than CHF. In other words, if you compare those patients enrolled early and later, let's say 2018 to 2022, the difference between those patients is not so much the CHF problem, it's the other problems that surround it. That's how I can explain that. And this was a surprise because the correlation is very, very strong. So in other words, those patients, those let's call them late starters, were sicker overall, not just the CHF, but other comorbidities that contributed to those healthcare costs, primarily via inpatient hospitalization costs.
So I'm going to move on, gentlemen. How do you identify the need for generating real-world evidence? How do you know exactly what healthcare professionals are looking to identify or learn more about?
Would you repeat the second part of your question, the other question, please?
Sure. So how do you identify the need for generating real-world evidence, and how do you identify what HCPs want to find out about?
Well, I guess, we are, in real-world evidence, we try to satisfy a question that many prescribers have. What exactly happens to my patients who are different from those patients that were just tested in phase 3? The inclusion and exclusion criteria in phase 3 are restrictive, and the label is liberal. So there is a difference, and we would like to know whether this drug works as well or better or worse in those patients that are eligible for the prescription. It's a very basic need to understand what would be the consequences of prescribing the drug to patients who are different from those enrolled in the RCT trials.
Yeah, and ultimately we're trying to identify health outcomes, right? Patients on a certain treatment, do they get better or not compared to patients that might be on a competitor or a different drug for the same diagnosis, right? So again, as Medora said, real-world studies kind of bring that, real-world evidence studies bring that additional benefit. Once a clinical trial is completed, we can follow these patients over time, many, many, many years, as long as we have the data to look at their specific health outcomes. Cost is just one part of it. CCI is just one part of it, but there's many other health outcomes that we can follow and identify, quantify for these patients over time using real-world evidence studies.
I have one other question that came in that I really find interesting that I want to follow up on. Can pharmacovigilance studies be considered as part of real-world evidence studies? What are your considerations here?
That's a great question. Go ahead, Pierre.
I'm not sure I understood the first part of the question. I'm really sorry to have you repeat it.
Sure.
Yeah, pharmacovigilance, right? Where
pharmacovigilance. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Pharmacovigilance, yeah.
Pharmacovigilance, as you know, focuses on side effects, adverse events. They don't look for anything else. So it's only a piece of the reality post-launch. If pharmacovigilance was extended to, efficacy parameters or whatever, that would resemble, classical real-world evidence studies, but it's not what pharmacovigilance does today. The other thing that I would say, and I don't know whether it came across because there was some noise in the background, but we just don't know why prescribers changed their attitude in prescribing Entresto between 2018 and 2022. Are they becoming more comfortable with the drug? Or, in other words, are these internal reasons or are these external reasons? In the sense that, the formulary is becoming more liberal, there is a lesser need for pre-authorization, those types of things. So they may be personal attitude, personality that changes over time, and they may be external factors that influence it. And we don't know what is what. But one thing is for sure, that those patients enrolled for the first time in 2022 are different from those in 2018. And they have PPM costs that are basically twice as high.
Well said. Very good point. I want to move on here because, again, we have quite a few questions that unfortunately we will not have time to address all today. Again, do not be discouraged. We'll be reviewing and responding to some questions offline. But this next question here, what kind of biases are present that you guys notice in real-world evidence studies, and how are they typically managed? Which ones are most common?
This is a question for Madhur.
This is very interesting. There is selection bias, right? And our study and findings may perhaps indicate exactly that less severe versus more severe patients. Is there a selection bias in terms of, how that label, which is a result of regulatory authorization, translates into physician behavior, right? And I mean, although we haven't answered that particular question in its entirety, but this is indicative of that, right? There is a severity difference between patients who start early, and there is a severity difference between patients who start, later down the road. And this again is indicative of selection bias, right? That physicians make individual decisions for that particular patient at that point of time in the real world, right? And they do not follow the inclusion-exclusion criteria, which is typically there in a clinical study protocol. So that is that. Then there is, of course, over a period of time, there may be a temporal, bias, like how a particular disease is treated like 10 years ago versus now. Like you would treat a type 2 diabetes patient much more aggressively now, right? Based on the treatment guidelines out there. So I mean, bottom line, there are all sorts of differences, and thus there exist techniques for statistically adjusting for those differences, and of course, one has to be very mindful of when designing such real world studies to account for, such biases. And I think a classic case in point is during COVID times, we had a lot of HCQ studies, which were later found to be, prone to biases because data was coming from the real world where some of these biases were not accounted for. So bottom line, yes, real world evidence has a lot of biases. RCTs by design are, made in such a way, in such a controlled manner that there is only one difference between the control and the study arm. Whereas in real world, you got to adjust for those biases, both in terms of study design, also in terms of statistical methodologies. But there are limitations to, all of those, and you may eventually not be able to eliminate all those biases, but just being aware of them itself is a big advantage.
And I'll just add to that, Medora, that was fantastic points. It's all about the data too, right? And real world evidence, studies are using real world data, right? And real world data is not perfect. It can be messy. You need to make sure that you have, good, clean data as much as possible to work with as well. So it's very important that you have good real world data in order to perform these real world evidence studies as well.
Yeah.
So we are going to get ready to wrap up. Oh, go ahead, Madhur. Go ahead.
No, just a point in closing. So, there are biases beyond selection bias, right? So, survival bias may be some, right? What you are observing are the observed observations, but what is unobserved, those observations also you got to account for, right? So that's something called survival bias. Again, that's more easily adjusted from a study design perspective than statistical adjustment perspective, but there are all sorts of biases that exist. Thank you.
So I want to follow that up with our final question that we'll have time for today. I think it's a really great way to close just based on what you both just mentioned here, but you just mentioned having good data, right? So if you have good real world evidence, how can we best communicate that evidence? As mentioned, maybe a challenge in the industry is that HCPs may not always understand the real world evidence sufficiently, and it's difficult to communicate these key insights with them. What are your best practices or considerations or suggestions here? And I know we're running short on time, and I feel like we could have an entire presentation around this, but it really is a great thing to walk away with today to consider and then lead into some future discussions.
Oh, what a loaded question that is, right? I mean, I think that's what pharma struggles with, all the time, right? We have these great studies performed. We have all these great insights. How do we communicate, those insights to HCPs and the medical community in general? I don't think I have a magic answer for that. It takes good education and a great team in order to follow up on that education to communicate those results, to the healthcare providers and studies that are with a clear objective, I think, with clear outcomes, and those insights that are easy to understand. And I think are probably the most important things to do in a study.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Well, that said, gentlemen, we are going to wrap up today's discussion. I want to thank all of you for your time. Again, I feel like the Q&A session, we could have, like you said, loaded questions and no clear, easy way to identify. Like you said, everything is it's a tough field out there. And especially when we look at real world evidence, it is a bit sloppy and it's a lot to analyze. So definitely a lot of great insights today to even consider for some future discussions. I want to thank you all for your time and commitment in the industry here. I'd also like to thank our audience members. Again, we had a lot of great questions populate in. We didn't have a chance to get through all of them today, but it just shows that our audience is just engaged in this presentation and really interested in this subject as well. And I want to thank, of course, NTT DATA for making today's webcast possible. As we do get ready to conclude the presentation, I'd like to ask our audience members if they wouldn't mind participating in a brief survey. The survey will appear on your screen just after the presentation concludes, and we greatly appreciate your insight toward future programs. You will also receive an email alerting you when today's webcast is available for replay, and we kindly invite you to forward that announcement on to any of your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. So again, thank you so much for everyone for joining. I hope we have some follow-up discussions based on today's discussion today, and I hope to meet with all of you again soon.